I was 30 years old, sitting at the top of a company that I had built with sweat, sacrifice, and a stubborn refusal to fail. From the outside, my life looked polished and enviable. People saw the CEO, the sharp suits, the luxury car parked in the reserved space, and the corner office with glass walls that caught the sunlight just right. But what they didn't see, what I kept hidden behind that immaculate exterior, was the emptiness I carried around like a shadow. Success came easily to me in numbers, deals, and projects, but in matters of the heart, I had nothing. Loneliness has a strange way of making even the brightest days feel dim. My schedule was full, but my life felt hollow. I'd mastered the art of smiling in meetings, of keeping my voice steady and confident in front of clients and employees, but behind closed doors, when the office lights went off and silence crept in, I felt like a man waiting for something undefined yet desperately needed. The truth was simple: I longed for closeness, for love, but I lived in a world where being honest about that could cost me everything. Being gay in the corporate world was a secret I carried like contraband. I never doubted who I was, but I had learned to hide it. In business dinners, when the conversation turned toward wives, girlfriends, or children, I would force a polite smile and redirect the talk. At company events, I always came alone, offering excuses about my busy life. It wasn't shame, it was survival. One wrong word, one careless confession, and I risked being judged, whispered about, or losing the authority I had fought so hard to establish. That was my reality until the day we brought in the new hires. I had decided to expand the team, bringing in young graduates on contract to inject fresh energy and ideas into the company. They were all about 25, wide-eyed, eager to prove themselves, brimming with ambition that reminded me of my younger self. Watching them walk into the office that morning holding folders and laptops was like watching a mirror of who I used to be: hungry, restless, determined. But among them, there was one who drew my attention without even trying. He wasn't the loudest, nor the most eager to impress. In fact, he was the opposite: serious, quiet, reserved. While others laughed loudly during introductions or tried to charm their way into conversations, he stood slightly apart, polite but distant, his eyes sharp with focus. He spoke only when necessary, his words deliberate and measured, and when he did speak, there was a depth to his tone that caught me off guard. At first, I told myself it was curiosity. I was intrigued by someone who didn't feel the need to fill the air with noise. But as the days passed, my curiosity turned into something else. I found myself watching him more than I should. The way he leaned over his desk, absorbed in his work. The way he adjusted his glasses when he was deep in thought. The way his serious expression would soften, just slightly, when he nodded at a colleague's comment. Small things, barely noticeable to anyone else, but to me they were magnets. I tried to be subtle, keeping my role as CEO firmly in place. I asked him questions about his work, complimented his precision on a report, or stopped by his desk with an encouraging word. He would acknowledge me with a polite nod or a brief smile, but he never lingered, never tried to stretch the interaction longer than it needed to be. And yet, I could feel something in the air, a quiet pull between us, unspoken but undeniable. Sometimes, when I passed by his cabin and saw him absorbed in his computer screen, I had to remind myself to keep walking. I wanted to step in, to ask him about his life, his thoughts, his dreams, but professionalism held me back. He was my employee and I was his boss. The lines were clear, and yet, my heart refused to see them. Nights were the hardest. I would go home, drop my keys on the table, loosen my tie, and sit in silence with the memory of his face lingering in my mind. It unsettled me, how someone I barely knew had managed to stir feelings I had locked away for years. For so long, I had told myself that love wasn't meant for people like me, at least not openly. But now, there was a flicker of possibility, fragile and delicate, growing inside me like a secret flame. I didn't know what would come of it or if it would come to anything at all. All I knew was that, for the first time in years, I wasn't entirely alone in my own heart. There was someone, serious, mysterious, reserved, who had managed to make the walls I had built around myself feel less permanent. And I found myself wondering, almost against my will, what it would feel like if those walls ever came down. Days turned into weeks, and my attraction to him only deepened. He wasn't someone who demanded attention, but rather someone who drew it in silence. While others cracked jokes in the break room or spoke animatedly during meetings, he remained composed, eyes focused, hands always working. His silence wasn't cold, it was thoughtful, deliberate. He spoke when he had something worth saying, and when he did, the room often stilled to listen. I tried to tell myself that I was just noticing him because of his seriousness, because he was different. But the truth ran deeper, and I knew it. I wasn't just paying attention to an employee's habits. I was falling into something I had no control over. There were little things that captured me, like the way he handled tasks with such care, as though even the smallest project deserved his full dedication. When others rushed to finish assignments, he took his time, ensuring accuracy, double-checking every detail. It was rare to see that kind of focus in someone so young, and it made me admire him even more. And then there were the gestures, small, fleeting, almost invisible moments that meant everything to me. One afternoon, during a particularly tense day, I found myself in the break room pouring coffee. My thoughts were heavy, clouded with deadlines and client demands. He walked in quietly, noticed my empty cup, and without a word, reached over to refill it for me. It was such a simple act, yet the unexpected kindness caught me off guard. I thanked him, and for the briefest moment, his lips curved into a faint smile. It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but it lingered in my mind for the rest of the day. Another time, during a review session, I leaned over his desk to point out something on his screen. As I did, our hands brushed, barely a touch, accidental, innocent. But the warmth of that contact jolted me like electricity. I withdrew quickly, masking the reaction with a professional comment, but inside, my heartbeat refused to calm. He didn't pull away though. He looked at me with a flicker of something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite name, but it wasn't indifference. Those quiet smiles, those rare but real glances became my lifeline. I began to crave them, searching for them in the middle of ordinary workdays. A nod of approval, the soft gratitude in his voice when I complimented his work, the way his serious expression would shift ever so slightly when he caught me watching him, all of it fed a growing ache inside me. And yet, alongside the longing, there was a constant battle raging in my mind. I was his boss. He was my employee. There were lines that should never be crossed, and I knew them better than anyone. I had built a reputation on professionalism, on control. What would happen if I let my personal feelings interfere? What would people think if they ever noticed? What if he didn't feel the same way and I ruined not only his trust but also his career? Every time I told myself to pull back, something happened that made me fall deeper. Like the day he stayed late, long after most of the staff had gone home. I passed by his cabin and saw him bent over his desk, the light casting a soft glow on his face. He didn't notice me at first, so I stood there quietly, just watching him. The concentration in his eyes, the way his brow furrowed slightly, the quiet determination in his posture, it was beautiful. He wasn't just working, he was giving himself fully to whatever he did. And I couldn't look away. I tried to reason with myself. I told myself that what I felt was admiration, nothing more. Admiration for his dedication, for his intelligence, for the way he carried himself with dignity far beyond his years. But the more I repeated it, the more hollow the words sounded. This wasn't just admiration, it was something much stronger, something that made me restless when he wasn't around and alive when he was. The worst part was how natural it felt. How easy it was for me to be drawn to him. In meetings, when he spoke up with a clear, thoughtful idea, I couldn't help but feel proud. When he nodded quietly as if to reassure himself that he was on the right track, I wanted to reassure him too, to tell him he was more than capable. And when he finally allowed himself a faint smile, rare, fragile but real, it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Late at night, when I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I replayed these small moments over and over. The accidental brush of his hand. The way his voice sounded when he said, "Thank you." The brief but meaningful look in his eyes when we crossed paths in the hallway. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining it all, that these were nothing more than fragments of hope stitched together by a lonely heart. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something mutual, something unspoken, growing quietly between us. It terrified me, and yet it thrilled me, because for the first time in years I felt alive. Not just as a CEO, not just as a man carrying responsibilities, but as a human being who longed, who desired, who hoped. He had awakened something in me that I thought I had buried for good. And though I tried to resist, every small gesture, every quiet smile, every fleeting touch pulled me deeper into a feeling I no longer wanted to escape. The deadline week arrived like a storm. Projects piled up, meetings stretched into long hours, and the office buzzed with urgency. Everyone knew the importance of the client we were preparing for, and no one complained about staying late. I admired my team for their dedication, but I couldn't help noticing how he, more than anyone else, worked tirelessly, never once letting frustration slip through his calm exterior. It was past 9 on the final evening of preparation when most of the staff began to leave. People shuffled out with tired smiles, murmuring goodnights, their shoulders heavy with exhaustion. I stood by my office window watching the lights of the city blink like distant stars, and for the first time in hours I considered calling it a night. I gathered my things ready to leave the chaos behind for tomorrow. As I stepped into the hallway, I noticed something unusual. At the far end of the corridor, a faint glow slipped through the glass panel of one of the cabins. My brows furrowed. Everyone had gone home, or at least they should have. Curiosity pulled me toward it, my footsteps echoing softly in the quiet office. When I reached the door, I saw him sitting at his desk with his jacket off, sleeves rolled up, papers scattered around him. His face was bent over his laptop, the blue glow illuminating his features, making him look both focused and weary. For a moment, I simply stood there, caught between admiration and concern. I tapped lightly on the doorframe. "You're still here?" He looked up, startled for a moment, then composed himself. "Yes, sir. I just thought I'd finish this part before heading out." I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me. "It's late. You've already done more than enough." He gave a small shake of his head. "I don't want to leave things half done. It's important." I sighed, moving closer and leaned against the side of his desk. "It's also important not to burn yourself out. You've worked hard all week. You deserve to rest." He finally leaned back in his chair, exhaling softly, as if only now realizing how tired he really was. There was a heaviness in his eyes, but also a determination that stirred something deep inside me. I wanted to tell him how much I admired that dedication, but more than that, I wanted to tell him what I'd been holding back for so long. The silence stretched between us, soft and intimate in the quiet of the empty office. The city lights outside flickered through the blinds, painting faint stripes across his face. My heart thudded, heavy and insistent, and I knew this was the moment I had either to bury my feelings forever or let them spill into the open. I swallowed hard, forcing the words past the wall of fear inside me. "There's something I need to tell you." He looked at me curiously, waiting, his expression unreadable. I've been keeping this to myself for weeks now," I continued, my voice low. "But I can't anymore. I know I'm your boss and I know this might be the worst possible thing to admit, but..." I drew in a shaky breath. "I like you. More than I should. More than is professional." The confession hung in the air like a fragile thread. My chest tightened as I watched his face, searching for a reaction. For a moment, his eyes widened in surprise, his lips parting slightly as though he hadn't expected the words. My stomach twisted. I feared I had crossed a line I could never uncross. But then, slowly, his expression softened. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with a quiet intensity. "I thought, maybe it was just me," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to risk it." My heart stumbled in relief. "So, you feel it too?" He gave a small nod, his eyes flickering away then back to mine. "I tried to ignore it. You're my boss. I didn't want to make things complicated. But every time you came by my desk, every time you noticed me, I felt something." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, a mix of disbelief and joy washing over me. The weight of weeks of silence lifted from my shoulders. Tentatively, I moved closer, lowering myself onto the edge of his desk. My hand hovered, unsure if I dared cross the final line. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," I said softly. "If this isn't what you want, I'll never bring it up again." He looked up at me, eyes shimmering under the dim office light. "I want it," he whispered. "I want this, tonight here with you." The world seemed to still around us. Without another word, I leaned forward, closing the space between us and pressed my lips to his. The kiss was soft, tentative at first, as though we were both afraid it might break us. But the moment our lips touched, something inside me unraveled. The emptiness I had carried for years cracked open, replaced by warmth, by connection, by a sense of belonging I had almost forgotten existed. He responded gently, his hands trembling slightly as he reached up, touching my arm. When I pulled back, I saw his eyes glisten, unshed tears threatening to fall. "I didn't think," he whispered, voice catching. "I didn't think anyone would ever see me like this." I cupped his face in my hands, my own throat tightening. "I've seen you from the very beginning. More than you know." He smiled then, a real smile, tender and raw. A tear slipped down his cheek and I brushed it away with my thumb. The sight of him, vulnerable yet willing, tore through every wall I had built around myself. For the first time in years, I wasn't a CEO, or a man burdened by titles and responsibilities. I was simply myself, sitting with someone who made me feel alive. In that quiet cabin, under the glow of a single lamp, we shared not just a kiss but an unspoken promise. One that neither of us had dared to hope for, but both of us desperately needed. The night outside stretched on, but within those walls time seemed to pause, holding us in a moment we would never forget. The morning after that night, everything in the office looked the same, the desks, the buzzing phones, the shuffle of papers, but nothing felt the same to me. Something inside me had shifted, as if the walls I'd built around my heart had finally cracked, letting light seep through. He walked in at his usual time, carrying his laptop bag, his expression calm as ever. For a brief moment our eyes met across the room. To anyone else, it was nothing more than a casual glance between colleagues. But to me it was loaded with meaning, a silent reminder of what we had shared in the stillness of the night before. From then on, our connection grew quietly, carefully, like a secret garden hidden in the middle of a crowded city. We didn't dare make it obvious. In the office we remained professional. I addressed him like any other employee, and he responded with the same measured tone he always used. But beneath the surface we were different. It began with small things, subtle, almost invisible to anyone watching. At lunch, when most of the staff gathered in groups, he started sitting near me, not directly beside but close enough that we could exchange quiet words without drawing attention. Sometimes he'd ask about a project, other times he'd slip in a small, personal question. What I liked to do outside of work, what kind of books I read. It wasn't much, but it was more than he had ever asked before, and I cherished every word. I noticed changes in him too. He began to open up in ways I hadn't seen before. His serious expression softened more often, replaced by a smile that felt reserved just for me. He laughed occasionally, a low, quiet laugh, but it was enough to make my chest tighten with warmth. He spoke a little more in meetings, his voice carrying confidence that hadn't been there before. And when he looked at me, really looked, it was no longer with the guarded eyes of an employee. It was something gentler, deeper. Still, we had to be careful. Every touch, every glance, every shared moment was a delicate balance between what we felt and what we could show. There were times when I wanted nothing more than to reach for his hand in the middle of the day, to brush my fingers against his as he passed me a file. But we both knew the risks. People noticed things. Rumors spread. One careless moment could undo everything. So we carved out our own little world, away from the watchful eyes of the office. After hours, when the building grew quiet, we'd linger. Sometimes he'd come into my office under the pretense of discussing work, and we'd end up talking about life instead. Dreams, fears, little pieces of ourselves we hadn't shared with anyone else. Those conversations stretched late into the night, the air between us thick with honesty and trust. On other nights, when we couldn't risk being seen together, we stayed connected through calls. I'd lie on my couch with the city lights glowing faintly outside my window, his voice on the other end of the line. We spoke about everything and nothing, the stress of the day, the music he liked, the books I recommended, even small, silly things that made us laugh. Hours slipped by unnoticed, and sometimes we ended the call reluctantly, only to message each other minutes later because we weren't ready to let go. And then there were the moments of tenderness, rare, fleeting, but unforgettable. A stolen kiss in the shadows of the parking garage, quick and breathless before anyone could see. The brush of his fingers against mine when he handed me a folder, deliberate enough to spark fire in my veins but subtle enough to look accidental. The way he leaned a little closer than necessary when showing me something on his screen, his breath warm, his presence overwhelming. It was dangerous, yes. But it was also beautiful. For the first time in years, I felt alive in a way that no deal or promotion could ever give me. I found myself looking forward to work not just for the projects, but for the chance to see him, to share even the smallest of moments. And he was changing too. The boy who had once been so reserved, so distant, now allowed himself to be vulnerable with me. He told me about his family, about the struggles he faced being misunderstood, about the fear of not living up to expectations. In those moments, I realized just how much trust he had placed in me, and I treasured it more than anything. There were challenges, of course. The constant fear of being discovered hung over us like a shadow. At times, I questioned whether I was being selfish, whether I was putting him at risk by letting this continue. The thought of jeopardizing his career haunted me. But whenever I voiced these doubts, he would shake his head, his eyes steady on mine. "I'm not here because of my job," he said once during a late-night conversation. "I'm here because of you." Those words silenced every fear, at least for a while. Our bond grew quietly but steadily, built not on grand gestures but on trust, respect, and the simple joy of being close. I didn't need fireworks or declarations. All I needed was the way he looked at me when no one else was watching, the way his voice softened when he said my name, the way his presence filled the empty spaces of my life with something warm and real. It wasn't easy and it wasn't safe, but it was ours. And with every passing day, I knew with greater certainty that what we had was more than fleeting desire. It was the beginning of something lasting, something worth every risk we took to protect it. For weeks, we floated in that secret world we had built, and it felt like nothing could touch us. Yet, beneath the sweetness of every shared glance and every whispered call, doubts grew quietly inside me like shadows waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. The first crack appeared when I was in a boardroom meeting. We had just wrapped up a presentation when one of the senior managers joked about how some of the new graduates seemed to be winning special attention from me. It was a harmless comment, met with laughter, but the words sliced through me. I smiled, played it off like everyone else, but inside I froze. Did they notice? Did someone see something I thought was invisible? That night, as I sat alone at home, the silence felt suffocating. I kept thinking about how fragile our secret was. One slip, one careless gesture, and the walls could come crashing down. The corporate world was ruthless. Rumors could spread, reputations could be ruined, and respect could vanish overnight. I tried to reassure myself that we were careful, that no one could possibly know. But the more I thought about it, the heavier the fear became. It wasn't long before he felt it too. One evening, after a long day, we sat together in my office. He was quieter than usual, fidgeting with a pen in his hand, his eyes darting to the floor instead of to me. "What's on your mind?" I asked gently. He hesitated before speaking. "Sometimes I wonder what people would think if they knew." I frowned. "What do you mean?" His voice was soft, almost pained. "What if they say I only got close to you because you're the CEO? That I used you for this job, for opportunities?" He looked up then, his eyes full of worry. "I don't ever want you to doubt me." His words hit me harder than I expected. Because I had thought about it too. Not because I doubted his sincerity, but because I knew how people twisted things they didn't understand. The idea of anyone questioning his integrity, or making him feel small, made my chest ache. "I would never believe that," I said firmly. "Not for a second." But even as I spoke, guilt coiled in me. He was right, it would look that way to others. And wasn't there truth in the imbalance between us? I was the CEO. He was my employee. The power lay with me whether I wanted it or not. I couldn't ignore that. What if, in some unspoken way, I had influenced him? What if he felt obligated to accept my feelings because of who I was? The thought made me sick. After that, a distance grew between us. It wasn't intentional, but it was there, hesitations, silences that hadn't existed before. He would linger less in my office, keep our conversations shorter. I in turn pulled back too, afraid of pushing him, afraid of crossing lines I had already blurred. Nights that used to be filled with calls stretched into emptier hours. I found myself staring at my phone, waiting for his name to appear, but it didn't. The silence was deafening. At the office, I carried on as usual, my voice steady, my demeanor calm, but inside I was unraveling. One night, long after everyone had gone home, I sat in my office staring at the city through the window. The glow of the skyline blurred as thoughts circled endlessly in my mind. Maybe I had been selfish. Maybe confessing to him had been a mistake. I was older, more experienced. I should have known better than to entangle my heart with someone who worked for me. He deserved someone free of all these complications, not a man bound by power, position, and fear. The more I thought about it, the more it hurt. For the first time since our connection began, I wondered if letting him go would be the kindest thing I could do. Just then there was a soft knock on my door. I turned, surprised, and saw him standing there. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes searched mine as he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "You've been avoiding me," I said quietly, unable to hide the ache in my voice. He lowered his head, guilt flickering across his face. "I know. Did I do something wrong?" My voice cracked despite my effort to keep it steady. "Was I selfish in telling you how I felt? Because if I was, I'll carry that blame. I never wanted to make you feel trapped." For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Then he walked toward me slowly, each step deliberate, until he stood just in front of my desk. He looked at me with eyes that shimmered, his voice trembling but clear. "You weren't selfish," he said. "I wanted this as much as you did. I still do." The words hit me like a lifeline. I stared at him, searching his face for doubt, but there was none. His shoulders shook slightly, and he clenched his hands as if forcing himself to stay strong. "I was scared," he admitted. "Not of you, not of us, but of what people might say, of how it might look. I hate the idea of anyone thinking I don't mean this, that I'm here because of what you can give me. But none of that is true. I'm here because I want to be." Something inside me broke open then, not with pain this time, but with relief. I stood, moving around the desk until I was in front of him. Without hesitation, I pulled him into my arms. He let out a shaky breath, leaning into me, his forehead pressed against my shoulder. I don't care what anyone thinks, I whispered into his hair. As long as you're sure about this, as long as you want this too, that's all that matters to me. I do, he murmured. I want you. I've wanted this since the beginning. The tension that had built between us dissolved, replaced by something steadier, stronger. In that embrace, I realized that our fears didn't diminish what we had, they proved how much it mattered. If it weren't real, we wouldn't be so afraid of losing it. And in that moment, holding him close, I knew I couldn't let go. Not now. Not ever. The days of silence and doubt weighed heavily on me, until one evening, when the office was quiet and the city outside glowed with its neon heartbeats, I knew I couldn't continue like this. I had built my empire on decisive choices, on taking risks, on standing firm when others faltered. Yet when it came to love, I found myself shrinking into shadows. And I couldn't let that define us. Not anymore. I asked him to stay after work. Not in his cabin this time, but in mine. He came in quietly as always, his eyes searching mine for a clue. The air between us was thick with things unsaid. I motioned for him to sit, but my heart was beating too loudly for calm. I've been thinking, I began, my voice lower than usual, almost trembling. About us. About what we're doing. About what it means. He sat forward, his hands clasped tightly together, and for a moment he looked so young, so vulnerable, that my chest ached. I've been thinking too, he admitted. And I'm scared. I'm scared of what people will say if they ever find out. I'm scared they'll think I'm with you for the wrong reasons. I took a deep breath and stood, pacing a little before stopping in front of him. Do you think that's what I believe? That you're only here because of my title, my power? His head shook quickly. No. But others might. And it hurts to imagine people reducing what I feel into something ugly. His voice cracked at the edges and I felt the raw honesty in every word. I lowered myself to my knees in front of him, breaking every wall of pride I had built as a CEO, as a leader, as a man who had always needed control. Listen to me, I said softly, taking his hands in mine. What we have, it's not about roles or power or jobs. It's about how you make me feel alive in a way I never thought possible. It's about how you look at me when you don't even know you're looking. It's about how, for the first time in my life, I don't feel alone in a room full of people. You. Always you. His eyes filled with tears, and in them, I saw the reflection of all my fears and all my hopes. He squeezed my hands tightly. I wanted this as much as you, he whispered. From the beginning, I wanted to be near you, to hear you, to feel seen. I've been hiding who I am for so long, pretending it doesn't matter. But with you, I don't have to pretend. I can just be me. The words hit me with a force I couldn't describe. For so long, I had lived in quiet disguise, letting the world applaud my success while it ignored the silence of my heart. And now, sitting across from him, I realized the truth. I didn't want to keep hiding. Not from him. Not from myself. I leaned forward, pressing my forehead gently to his. Then let's promise something. Even if we can't tell the world, even if we have to keep it between us for now, we won't lie to each other. No more masks. No more fear when it's just us. He let out a trembling breath, then smiled through the tears. I can promise you that. It felt like a vow, stronger than anything I had signed in a boardroom. In that moment, we decided, not about a public declaration, not about how others would see us, but about honesty, about trust, about a love we would nurture in the light and in the dark. And with that, the distance between us dissolved. I pulled him into my arms, holding him as though the world outside no longer mattered. Because in truth it didn't. Not when I had finally chosen him. Not when he had chosen me too. Time has a way of softening edges. The doubts, the whispers of fear, the walls I had once built around myself, all of them slowly melted in the quiet heat of his presence. Months passed, and what began as fragile moments stolen in secrecy grew into something steady, unshakable. He was changing before my eyes. The boy who once kept his head lowered in the office, careful and quiet, now met people with a calm confidence. His voice carried more strength in meetings, his ideas sharper, and yet he still carried that kindness, that gentleness, that had first disarmed me. And I found peace. For the first time in years, I wasn't living for the next deal, the next achievement. I was living for him. Our rhythm became natural. Mornings brought coffee and little smiles across the desk. Evenings sometimes ended with long walks, away from the office lights, where we could hold hands without fear. There were still challenges, moments when I caught myself worrying about appearances or when he hesitated, wondering if our secret would someday spill, but with each passing day our trust deepened. And the weight grew lighter because we carried it together. I watched him bloom. He laughed more easily, spoke more freely, leaned into me when he was tired instead of hiding his weariness. And in those moments, when he rested his head on my shoulder, I realized how far we had come from that first quiet night when I found him working alone. The walls between us were gone. What remained was something unshakable, something real. One evening, after another long day, I invited him up to the rooftop of the office building. The city stretched out before us, alive with lights that flickered like stars on earth. He leaned against the railing, the wind catching his hair, his eyes reflecting the skyline. I stood beside him, slipping my hand into his. He didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. His fingers closed around mine, strong and sure. "You've changed me," I admitted quietly, watching the horizon. He turned, his gaze steady. "No, you've only found the part of yourself you'd buried. You just needed someone to remind you." His words struck something deep within me. For so long I had thought of myself as two people, the CEO polished and untouchable, and the man inside hollowed out by loneliness. But with him those pieces no longer warred. They belonged together because he had stitched them with his patience, his trust, his love. I leaned in, brushing my lips against his. A soft kiss, slow and certain under the open sky. The kind of kiss that wasn't about hiding or urgency but about presence. About truth. His hand tightened in mine and I felt the quiet power of acceptance. His and mine. We stayed there side by side watching the city breathe around us. And in that silence, I understood something I had never dared to believe before. Love wasn't a weakness. It wasn't a distraction. It was the anchor I had been searching for, the warmth that filled the emptiness I had carried for years. If my life had been a long stretch of cold rooms and echoing footsteps, then he was the light that finally filled them. The boy who had once sat quietly at his desk was now the man who held my heart without even trying. And as I stood there, hand in hand with him, I knew this with certainty. Love had changed me. It had turned my silence into laughter, my loneliness into belonging, my emptiness into warmth.